Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. With a ceasefire process now potentially underway, is a permanent end to Israel's war on Gaza on the horizon? Let's get to the bottom line. The bloodiest chapter in Palestinian-Israeli history may be coming to a close. And let me emphasize, may be coming to an end. For the millions of Palestinians in Gaza, the ceasefire deal may mean a chance to piece together their lives after losing tens of thousands of their loved ones to Israeli bombing campaigns over the past 15 months, and losing their homes, their schools, their hospitals, their food, clean water, everything. And for Israelis, it means that the dozens of hostages that have still been held in Gaza since October 7th will finally be released, and the country can step back from its war footing. The deal couldn't have been reached without heavy pressure from the United States, with officials from both the incoming and the outgoing administrations playing a part. But the devil is in the details. So what lies ahead now? Today we're talking with Charles Dunne, adjunct professor of international affairs at George Washington University and a former director at the U.S. National Security Council. Charles, thank you so much for being with us. Would love to just get your take on this moment, and what are you confident in? What are you worried about?
The bad news to me is that there are still so many moving parts here that it's going to be hard for the countries that helped to negotiate this, the United States, Qatar, and Egypt, to keep this whole thing moving. There's still apparently many details to be decided about which prisoners are going to be released, which hostages are going to be released. How far are the Israelis going to withdraw from the Gaza population centers? They're supposed to withdraw from all the central parts. And these are just some of the initial questions before we even get to the hard questions in Phase 2 and Phase 3 of the ceasefire.
Well, let's get to another voice in this negotiation, and that is incoming President Donald Trump. He says this epic ceasefire agreement could have only happened as a result of our historic victory, meaning his, in November, as it signaled to the entire world that my administration would seek peace and negotiate deals to ensure the safety of all Americans and our allies. So that's one portion of a very, very long message from President Trump. Is there some dynamic where President Trump simply has more leverage than President Biden did in these matters?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I find this very interesting because apparently the Trump factor was pretty much decisive. Now, what we've seen in public is the incoming Trump administration and President Biden's administration working hand in hand to get this deal done. But I do think it was fear of Trump that, whichever way you want to look at it, either forced Netanyahu into agreeing to a deal or gave him the political cover from Washington that he needed to steamroll opponents in his security cabinet. No less than Steve Bannon said that that whole statement that Trump made earlier about all hell will break loose if there isn't a deal reached before he comes into office on Inauguration Day wasn't aimed at the Palestinians. It wasn't aimed at Hamas. He said it was aimed at Netanyahu. And certain Israeli observers have said the same thing. It was a message to Netanyahu that he had to get this deal done. So, and apparently Steve Witkoff, who is Trump's Middle East negotiator, gave a very tough message to Bibi Netanyahu when he visited a short time ago. It's along these same lines. So I am persuaded that Trump's intervention, threats, his bluster, which we're all used to, was a very important factor in getting the ceasefire agreed to.
So let me take it a little step further. I mean, I've known you for years. You've been a long-term analyst, a dispassionate analyst, as best I can tell, of what's going on in the Middle East. Why do you think President Biden failed, with all the power the United States has, with the clear financial and military support that the United States has towards Israel, even modest flirtation with some conditioning of that aid and support, and with the world watching and with judgments about genocide coming out of International Court of Justice and others? Why did President Biden fail and Donald Trump, with a as he writes in his tweet, even before he became president, succeed so quickly?
Right.
What's the element of leverage that one had that the other doesn't?
Well, I think a couple of things are at work here. For one thing, I think President Biden is a prisoner of his own past. He's had a very long series of positions in support of Israel. He's been part of what I think of as the Washington Consensus on Middle East policy, which is very much in favor of supporting Israel, which he clearly did to Israel's advantage during this entire crisis. But that also made him unwilling to break with his own past and his own views when it became apparent, for example, that Israel needed to be pressured a little bit more decisively to come to an agreement. And I think that was definitely one problem. President Biden has frequently described himself as a Zionist. He's very sympathetic to the Israeli people. It was very hard for him to break from that emotional standpoint. And also, of course, there were political concerns, how this would affect the election. And I think that was a factor which they don't like to talk about, but was nevertheless
well, let's talk about it for a second. Yeah. I mean, where did you hear empathy, sympathy, concern for Arab American voters in President Trump's statement about American and Israeli hostages? Is there hope that Donald Trump is going to be fair and important for their sympathies with whatever they think, an end of the war, an end of the conflict, greater justice for Palestinians? Is that on Donald Trump's dashboard at all?
Well, I have written before, and I do believe that concern for the Palestinians is not going to be a major factor in the second Trump administration. It's very clear, to me at least, from what happened in the first Trump administration, from the Kushner peace plan, which basically didn't grant Palestinians a sovereign state at the end of the negotiations at all, to the various steps that President Trump took to ratify Israeli positions on the Golan Heights, moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, eliminating the American consulate in East Jerusalem, which is the effective representative to the Palestinian people, shutting down funding to UNRWA. There were so many different steps that indicate there was not overwhelming concern about what is going to happen to the Palestinian people. I see no reason in particular to believe that this is going to change in the second Trump administration. But I do believe that President Trump can surprise. And that's one of the things that might make some of his best allies in the Middle East, including Israel, uncomfortable, as we've seen with these negotiations over the ceasefire.
Right. Well, outgoing President Biden and his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, have both talked about the Palestinian people and their future recently. Let's look at what President Biden had to say. The idea that Israel is going to be able to sustain itself for the long term without accommodating the Palestinian question, it's not going to happen. And in the same vein, this is what former Secretary of State Antony Blinken had to say.
Israelis must decide what relationship they want with the Palestinians. That cannot be the illusion that Palestinians will accept being a non-people without national rights. 7 million Israeli Jews and some 5 million Palestinians are rooted in the same land. Neither is going anywhere. Israelis must abandon the myth that they can carry out de facto annexation without cost and consequence to Israel's democracy, to its standing, to its security.
So is the statement by President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken just simply pathetic, or does it matter?
Look, I think it does matter, and I think they're right about this. And this has been the orthodoxy in Washington on the Palestinian-Israeli issue for decades, and previous administrations have tried to solve it. The ironic thing that I find in these statements is the fact that they discovered the Palestinian issue only after October 7th. Their previous policy towards the region was based on the Trump administration's policy, which was follow the Abraham Accords into government-to-government peacemaking. And you could safely ignore the Palestinians. And the Syrian issue, too, by the way, which we can talk about if you like. So they started to talk at that point, after October 7th, about an endgame that would involve a Palestinian state, Palestinian self-determination, negotiations to get there. But what they didn't do when talking about the two-state solution is put any details into this. They didn't offer an American proposal to do this. They didn't even name a Middle East envoy whose job it was to go and set up negotiations and talk to both sides. So it seemed to me that this was the elevator music, as David Ignatius has put it, of,
David Ignatius of the Washington Post.
Exactly. The elevator music that Americans play when they're talking about the Middle East peace process, but are not terribly serious about it.
Well, that's an incredible metaphor. Elevator music.
I love
the Biden administration, I think it's good. And then even before October 7th, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said, hey, there hadn't been a greater period of calm and quiet in that relationship, and then we saw the blow-up. But is there a danger that the hubris of this moment could actually undermine Israeli security down down the road if they don't somehow shift on this question of where Palestine and Palestinians fit in this equation?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And you're correct that Netanyahu kept this war going until he achieved some rather dramatic aims. And we could throw in the overthrow of Assad, who suddenly found himself without an Iranian ally who could help him.
And a Russian ally that didn't show up.
Absolutely, because they had their own problems. So Netanyahu has achieved some real strategic gains. And the old adage is that going back 30 years or more, that attributed to the Israelis apocryphally, that, when we are weak, how can we make peace? When we're strong, why should we make peace? And I think that's the situation we find ourselves in. And here's where the administration is right. I think they do risk making a strategic mistake if they ignore the Palestinian people, ignore their putative Arab allies' concerns about having a Palestinian state, and all the instability that this vacuum can let in down the road. Ignoring the Palestinian problem, we saw what happened on October 7th. And that was in large part a result of the fact that this wasn't dealt with. There was no political end game. And if there isn't now, I do think the Biden administration is right that this is going to result in strategic problems, not only complicating their relationships with the Arab states that they want better security relations with, but it could actually create instability in close allies right now that they do have relationships with. If Palestinians are forced into Egypt, which is a serious fear of the Sisi regime, if they are forced from the West Bank into Jordan, which the Jordanians are terrified of, two key allies can be destabilized. These are just some of the results that I think could come out of ignoring this problem or making it worse. I mean,
well, you talk about Jordan and Egypt, and I've talked with both the foreign minister of Egypt in the past, as well as leading officials in Jordan. And I said, is there anything in this circumstance that could force you to rip up your peace agreement with Israel? Both avoided that, stepped aside from that, didn't want to counter that, but said at the same time that both what Israel was doing, but also the displacement of Palestinians would be so abhorrent, completely unacceptable. And you see all these equations, and you just sort of wonder, how is it going to work out? Because you've got now, I don't know if you've seen the pictures of what northern Gaza looks like, and even move to southern Gaza. No. That's a decimated society. It's not just that at the moment of this show, 46,000 people have been killed. Who knows how that will grow down the road, because you've got infrastructure blown apart, not just tunnels of Hamas, but schools, churches, food banks, businesses, wiped out. I've had a guy from the United Nations in here whose job is to sort of look at, the human right of essentially infrastructure, if you will, and domiciles and housing. And he said, we're not looking at years in terms of, we're looking at decades. Right. So I guess in that equation, how do you, from your perspective, think that the world is going to come together to begin dealing with some of that element? Because if it's not fixed, aren't you planting the roots and grievances for whole new waves of instability in the future?
Yeah, and we've seen this happen again and again and again. After the Oslo Accords essentially collapsed, we saw further waves of terrorism against Israel. We've seen repeated exchanges of rocket fire and airstrikes between Hamas and Israel over and over again. We've seen repeated efforts by the international community, to muster all these resources and retraining of the Palestinian security forces. And those have gone in cycles and tended to peter out. And with a disaster of this magnitude, you can easily see how after a few years of throwing money at the Gaza problem, the attentions of the international community are going to go elsewhere. Even if the Trump administration succeeds in building, let's say, an Arab coalition under UN supervision to go in and help restore order in Gaza.
I mean, it's interesting you say that. Couldn't that be an interesting building block to give Trump what he wants, which was a deal with the Saudis as well? Wouldn't an Arab coalition that came in largely with that possibly be the platform for a Saudi-Israeli deal?
That could be the platform, and that's very important to do. On the other hand, there'd have to be a serious path to a Palestinian state. According to what the Saudis said—
A real state?
A real state. They might be willing to accept less, a state with a flag and, police and so on, but something that is contiguous and basically self-ruling, which is not at all what the Israelis seem to have in mind right now. Now, there are two minds. Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, reported a few weeks ago that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia indicated privately that he doesn't care at all about the Palestinian solution, of the Palestinian people, which I can readily believe. A lot of Arab leaders have dissed them or dismissed them in the past until all of a sudden they have to deal with the problem again. But the official Saudi position is that they do want to see movement towards a two-state solution. And in fact, one of the last things that Tony Blinken said is it has to be time limited. In other words, we can't, as they say in Syria, bukra fil mishmish, when the apricots bloom, right? Which means never, right? It's got to be something where you can say by such and such a date, these negotiations will be done and a Palestinian state can be in place. I don't see that happening under certain current political circumstances.
Do you see any introspection about the limits of American power, either, by the United States looking at what it's done or Israel? I mean, Israel said its goal was to decimate Hamas, to rip Hamas out. Honestly, my sense as an observer is that has not completely happened, but it has happened in significant ways. And so to give this process some credit at enormous tragic cost on the civilian side. And I don't know, given our own experience of the United States in areas like Iraq and Afghanistan, that equation between how many future fighters are you, generating in terms of what you're trying to do constructively. So there's that question about, whether they've succeeded in decimating Hamas. But I think the second part of it is, at what point is there an inflection point where you've got to begin thinking about there are real limits to military power, and do you think there's any sense of introspection or realization of that by either American policymakers or Israeli policymakers?
No, I think we've reached that point of a certain amount of introspection on the limits of American power. I mean, some of the comments by Tony Blinken in his Atlantic Council speech sort of indicated that we can't do this alone. We can't use American forces to force a solution. President Trump, I think, is very much of the same mind. I think the last thing on his agenda would be to use American force to go in to even provide peacekeepers in a relatively low-stress situation. So I think there is introspection on the part of several administrations about the limits to American power. I'm concerned that there isn't similar introspection on the level of Israeli policymakers right now. They have won some significant strategic victories, as we discussed. And Prime Minister Netanyahu's career seems to have been somewhat salvaged by pursuing this war to the point that we've seen it now. But I also think it's true that they don't, aside from this vague intention of destroying Hamas, they don't have any strategic outcomes in mind, specific goals that they want to achieve, not even for how Gaza is going to be governed in the coming year, for example. We don't hear any of that from the Israelis. So I think there is a chance that they could overextend themselves in the region, and we could be faced with further strategic challenges that the United States is going to be inevitably drawn into, whether it's in Syria or in Iran or elsewhere.
Let me look at your powers of looking into the future on, a couple elements of the chessboard around Israel. First is the West Bank, and we've seen, frankly, staggering number of killings there and death there, expansion of further settlements and whatnot, and sort of greater toxicity in the West Bank. We're quickly approaching a deadline or an expiration date of a ceasefire with Lebanon, and we have a very new government in Syria. So I'd love to get your take on whether the situation facing Israel right now in the broader Middle East is becoming more stable, or is potentially still in that tinderbox of potential explosion again.
We use the word potential, and that's how I would describe it. It's potentially more stable. I mean, we really are at kind of, to use the old cliche, an inflection point. But Middle East always seems to be at an inflection point of some kind or another. Here we are again. As I said, Israel has managed to accomplish strategically in the last 15 months, and especially in the last 3 months, things that we never thought would be possible given years. So it's going to take really adroit diplomacy and some restraint on Israel's part to take full advantage of this. And it's going to take engagement, it's going to take money, it's going to take leadership from the Trump administration to bring together international partners to help stabilize each of these situations. I worry that the Trump administration is kind of alien to this type of effort, that it's going to be required. Trump himself, of course, famously tweeted, "Don't get involved," in all caps, referring to Syria. They're not our friend, not our fight. Well,
how do you think he sees the West Bank?
Okay, I'm afraid that he sees the West Bank as Israel's problem to solve. And what we've seen over the last 15 months with the increase in violence, including settler violence, and abetted by the Israeli security services in many cases, something that a lot of people, including me, worry might be a precursor to ethnic cleansing and the expulsion of Palestinians. Now, I don't think Trump specifically wants to see it, but this could go fairly far down the road before his administration decides to get involved and say no if it does. And that is what really worries me about the current situation.
Let me just ask you finally, Charles, many American presidents come to office, so that our audience understands, who decide they want to be different than their predecessors, who do not want to be engaged in certain conflicts, but somehow the world has a way of knocking on their door and saying, "You're not going to ignore us," and just shoving a crisis into the Oval Office desk. What kinds of challenges do you think might face Donald Trump? Because he said very clearly on any number of crises, he doesn't see them as America's problems. How long do you think he's going to be able to stay in that position?
I don't think he's going to be able to stay there for very long. I mean, for one thing, I think he would like the allies to take the lead in the Middle East. This means Israel, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and so on. But they're suddenly facing challenges with an Afghanistan-like deterioration in Syria, the collapse of the ceasefire in Lebanon, and the comeback of Hezbollah, a more aggressive and threatening Iran, which could certainly happen if they see advantages. These allies are going to come calling on the Oval Office for help, and Trump can't ignore it, especially since he sees our interest in, to a certain extent, bound up in military, economic, and other kinds of ties with these same governments. And they've said, we want to strongly support our allies. That's going to be a real test for them.
Well, listen, fascinating conversation. Former U.S. National Security Council official Charles Dunne, thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure, Steve.
So what's the bottom line? I'm just not going to get rapturous about the possibility of a real ceasefire yet. It treats the politics of this moment, the countless Palestinians who've been killed and maimed and under siege, the dozens of Israeli hostages who've been held, as a single punctuation point, when what would make this real is not a sprint of calm that could fall apart, but rather a marathon in the suspension of killing and destruction. That's what we need to see. Humanitarian aid needs to flow freely, and genuine discussions about the future of constructive governance and real justice and autonomy for Palestinians needs to be baked into this moment. I don't yet believe that this ceasefire solves many of the dramatic issues that have fed this crisis and have kept it burning. It would be great, believe me, to be wrong and to see a new, fair, and just equilibrium between Israel and Palestine emerge from these fires. But we just aren't there yet. And that's the bottom line.